Thank you, Dana. And thank you all for being here. I'm excited to start conversation and talk a little bit about the exhibit, but also think in a collective manner of, 2020 was a very kind of pivotal year for many reasons, as we know. I mean, many stuff that I wanted to visually talk to and have conversations through my visual art, but also in thinking of ways of how can we move past and even just in the mourning process and an acknowledgement of what happened. The conversations now, I think, could be very very welcoming in terms of hope. I mean, after pain and after suffering and loss, there's always this imagining of hope and what can we imagine for the future. So I'm excited to have conversations with all of you, answer questions that you may have. I did want to maybe start with just kind of giving you a visual for those of you who haven't been to Charter Oak or who are far away from Connecticut and Hartford in particular, just to show you a little bit of the pictures, and then we can start the conversation, and I can refer back to any pictures once we get into the questions. So as I mentioned, this project actually was funded by the Free Center in Hartford, Connecticut, as part of their Independent Artist Fund in last year, and I started this in thinking about 2020, trying to see how I could, express everything that I was observing in 2020. So. The first painting that we have with the help of Pierre, and I have to give thanks to Pierre, the director and curator of the gallery, who asked me to bring the works to Charter Oak, but also who helped me kind of in his curatorial manner to have a sequence of placing. So as you walk in, you'll see X marks the spot. It was a way for me to talk about kind of placing us in 2020. And a lot of the lines that you see there in the background, I did with ink with fountain pens, and then over top I put kind of acrylic paint, and I played with mediums. So just to have a little bit more of a close-up, kind of the layering, that's something that is very typical of what I do or what I try to do with my art, is just think about layers. And I think a lot of artists do that in itself, but playing with the translucency of colors to again kind of invoke, specifically with 2020, the layering of all of these things that have been happening. After this painting, I did write a poem last year that is connected to the painting. So there are two paintings that have poetry connected to them. This is one of them, talking about coordinates. And I'll read it very quickly because I do want to get to the conversation. When is a point a departure, a destination, a crossing, a temporary stop, a direction, a center, an origin? We draw lines to a post connected to a timeline, coordinates to stories overlapped. We hold our breaths between the lines, hoping the crossing doesn't scar us. We fear our ties to this chart, but even a circle is a line. After this poem, we move on to Brushed by Fire. This is a totally abstract painting that kind of references the brush fires in Australia that actually, they were happening in 2019 in September. Also in Oregon and California. California actually declared a state of emergency because of the wildfires. So the first images that we had of 2020 were of fire. And then they kind of started to be controlled in March, when all of a sudden we started getting into kind of the official pandemic, the closings and all of that. So again, I tried to play with different layering. The colors are essentially, I mean, they're very striking because of their primary colors. So the blues and the reds and the yellows with the whites. So those are and the black. It's just to kind of highlight. And then right after this painting, I made this If Water Was a Muscle, to talk about kind of the continuous efforts by water protectors, indigenous water protectors, that have been fighting for a very long time, specifically thinking about the Enbridge Energy Company, Line 3 and Line 5, which kind of cross over treaty lands, indigenous lands in Minnesota, and also in my home state of Wisconsin, and Superior, Wisconsin, actually. And here I wanted to kind of push the view into oil and the spilling of oil into waterways. And so I played with specific mediums that were, in a way toxic to, even to me while I was working with them, just to kind of think about, the toxicity that is in our waters, and especially affecting indigenous communities. Then I have this Cries for Liberation. This came from a kind of thinking about how can I essentially talk and have a conversation on visual painting about Black Lives Matter. I was very specific in this project that I didn't want to create anything that was specifically violent or depicting violence against Black bodies. I think we've seen enough of that. So what I ended up doing was I was actually looking through some photographs, one of those being kind of the map that Black Lives Matter were doing in placing, where the protests were happening. And one of the things that was very striking is the actual map of the US, and seeing these little spurs of, color coming up in the map. And also thinking about, this, even with this, I wanted to play with this, the Rorschach test. When we look at at one of those Rorschach tests, it's essentially, what do you see? And for me, it's almost like, this is the kind of depiction of the US. In 2020, there were these constant, push for, for us to acknowledge, that Black Lives Matter, and the killing of Black bodies, and how, those have been happening for many, many years, maybe even we can say centuries. But at the same time, it's again kind of this push to acknowledge that. After this, I have Unwelcome Embrace. And I wanted to specifically, this was the first one that's a little bit more structured, or structural, I should say. This is what I call an anti-monument. I wanted to draw attention to how during the pandemic, we still had detention centers at the border with children and mothers. And the kind of the material that I used were actually the mylar blankets that they were giving families to stay warm. And in reading those stories from the mothers, how they kind of compared it to aluminum foil, and how, it was so traumatic that they can't use aluminum foil now. And kind of a push or a critique of that, but also in reading the poem by Emma Lazarus, The New Colossus, and that is actually engraved in the Statue of Liberty. And, the depiction of Lady Liberty as the welcoming, symbol to people who are dispossessed, that are, searching for a new home. And for me, this was, kind of a reminder. This antique monument is a little bit of, we haven't held up our end of the bargain with that ideal. So I painted water in the background, specifically because of the border. There is a physical border, but there's also a natural border separating us, and this material wrapping around the canvas to kind of almost sometimes in a very taut position, kind of suffocating. So it's almost like an unwelcomed embrace, as the title is called. Then I did this where this was probably a little bit of realistic, a Requiem for Their Dreams, where I actually used some used face masks that I had worn for a period of time. I had to obviously secure them, put them aside, and for me, it was very important to kind of have this idea of an atonement for the lives that we have lost because of COVID. And also because of, Black Lives Matter, when we heard so many times over and over again, the "I can't breathe," and not to conflate the two, but, this idea of breath being taken from you, whether it's from, forcefully by a police officer, or even from a pandemic. And so this is kind of looking down. I wanted to, the viewpoint, I wanted it to be almost like as if we were looking down, in a hole around a tree of oranges. And the tree of oranges is kind of a literary reference to a short story from Mexican writer Gabriela Damian Mirabete, who wrote this short story about femicides. And she imagines this kind of distant future for women to be dreaming in a garden full of oranges. So that kind of background or that literary reference came in when I was working on this, and then inspired this. So I also worked with some lead. So I worked with different materials throughout the project, but this one specifically, I mixed lead with black ink. So in the middle, what you have are kind of these, very striking pieces of the face masks, kind of staring at you in the middle. With that, I also had, this was the other painting that I had a poem with that I actually wrote in the summer of 2020, and thinking about these two, the breathing, the, taking away breath from someone. So I'll read it. To breathe, to motion, an automatic maneuver of inhaled carbon impurities and oxidized indifference. I breathe in pollutants left behind by war, by history, the chemtrails of your oppression. Vapors are held inside this feeble body, creating a mnemonic memory, ever clear, of invisible scars. And yet my organism recycles this miasma only to exert gasps of hopes, and dreams. And still for some, to breathe is a privilege. The last painting that I have, that I created was the compounded oppression. And this was kind of thinking about the killing of trans youth in 2020 specifically, and also having literary references, poem and an article by Audre Lorde, who speaks about how, you know, these, if we think about intersectionality, which is very connected to Black women specifically, you know, for Audre Lorde in the poem and in the article, it's deciding what oppression is going to be, you know, the one that is going to affect her that day, whether it was because she was a lesbian or because of a Black woman. So kind of this focus of specifically of trans youth who were killed, they were trans of color. And thinking about, you know, kind of the oppression and how at the very root, it starts to be compounded. So wanted to play with tears. I wanted to kind of do an inverted hierarchy. So if we think of a hierarchy in you know, in the caste system, for example, we always have, you know, kind of the privileged at the top, and then the more oppressed at the bottom. Here, I wanted to specifically focus on the oppressed and how that the compression of the oppression, you know, can feel. So I again worked with some lead, some iron, and thought about kind of, you know, if we look at the earth and look at the layers of the earth, at the very core, we have iron, and it's very dense. So I wanted to play with a little bit also with the viewpoint of kind of looking out into a city and city lights. And when you look at the city lights, the areas that are darkest are the ones that are not as illuminated as others. And again, kind of calling into that oppression, even just in city views. So again, I put there some close-ups of the painting. Yeah, and I mean, I can bring these back whenever you have any questions, but I would love to have a conversation.
So I guess I'll start with a few questions and then we'll open it up to everybody. Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So Diana, is this art project connected to your academic research? And can you speak a little bit more about your areas of research?
Yes, I mean, my research is mainly looking at literary work and how, you know, depictions of violence and not necessarily for the joy of looking at violence in literature, but, you know, look at the effect of such literature. And I do, a lot of my interests in academic interests fall under social justice. So it is in some ways connected, especially the border. I do a lot of border studies, especially with femicides at the border. But in a way, it is connected. Others, it's kind of this need and interest to talk about issues of social justice that 2020 gave us quite a bit to talk about in that respect.
How do you keep your spirits up when you're looking at such difficult material?
That's a very good question. I think I definitely have to disconnect at times and have to have some space and time away from reading, seeing, talking about violence. But I think at in the end, I think having these conversations are necessary, to one, acknowledge, two, and thinking of ways of how to move forward, or even just thinking of ways that could be different, and planning. So definitely, having breaks definitely have to happen, and also just yeah, taking some space away from dealing with the material.
What do you hope happens inside people when they look at your work?
I think, for this project, the invisibility of suffering, is in connection to my artwork that is abstract. I think what I'm hoping is that people look beyond. I think, it's almost like violence happens uh, day to day everywhere, and it's hidden in plain sight. So if we're not really looking beyond, or even just uh, paying attention, I think we can miss a lot from a lot in the loss and suffering that people are going through. That's why, my preferred style is abstract art, but at the same time, it's purposeful in this project, because I want people to look beyond, but also to acknowledge that, you know, all of these things that I talk about in the project, they're not they didn't come up out of a vacuum in 2020. They've been happening for many, many years. So even looking beyond 2020, looking at the connections, the wildfires and the brush fires, thinking about, our climate, the violence against Black bodies, that, we have Black Lives Matter to just kind of this cry, have been happening for centuries. And immigration, and even the pandemic. I mean, what mishaps have happened before the pandemic that brought us to where we are right now. So it's looking beyond. I guess that's what I hope, that you're moved enough to see beyond the painting, maybe even think about the actual topics, and reflect on them.
How did you, yeah, they're very, very powerful. How did you come to this? Like in your childhood or in your young adult life, like what draws you to social justice through the arts?
Um, so I grew up with a father who wanted to be a lawyer. My sister, who is here, actually, Griselda, is a lawyer, also. So the feeling of, always speaking against violence, against injustice, was pretty much in our household. Just saying that was wrong. If you see something, speak up, and call it out. So that was encouraged at home. And for me, that transferred over into my academic work in looking at violence against women. And then now with, using art as a vehicle to speak on violence, but not to kind of revisualize violence on canvas. I didn't want to do that. So it has been encouraged throughout my life, to speak against things that are not that are violent, that are unjust. So that was a very good question. I didn't think about that. Sure.
And let me ask you this, in working with the masks or the Mylar, what did that feel like
Oh,
as you were in the process of creating these things?
yeah, thank you for asking that. It was a very difficult process. I think the hardest piece was the one with the Mylar blankets. Just because coming from a very empathetic process of just thinking through of this is what they were using. At many points, I actually would, wrap it around myself to see how it would feel. And then I would have this adverse reaction. I would have to put it aside. The material itself literally gave me nightmares because I was working close to in my bedroom with this material, and at some points when it moves, it actually crackles like fire. So it would wake me up at in the middle of the night. So it was very difficult to touch it, to work with it. The masks, it did take me to, contemplating and having these moments of reflection of how many lives we have lost. All of us have been touched by COVID in one way, or restrictions, by loss, by, having family members pass. So I had to take several moments to just step away, especially because of the materials. And, there is a little bit of horror when it comes to inanimate materials that reflect or that are connected to a specific moment in time. The theorist, Hannah Arendt, would say that, looking at the mountain of shoes from the Holocaust, that in itself, the symbol of it, is horrifying. So I'm, thinking about these materials, which was a question from a friend who said, you're not depicting violence, but you are using sometimes in a way these materials that for some are reminders of the horrors of 2020 and beyond.
It sounds like despite, I'm going to use this word, but despite whatever trauma it might cause in you, you're really committed to doing this.
Yes, absolutely. I think the little bit of discomfort does not compare to the loss that I think a lot of people have felt, whether it's a family member dying from COVID, dying because they were killed by police, or, being so close to polluted, toxic water that there's no way around it, or being, not having a home because of, the fire. So the little bit of discomfort for me is worth it, in that if we can have a conversation and, to push through and use the artwork to talk about it, then so be it.
So you're very courageous, and you're not only an artist, you're a warrior.
Thank you.
Seems to me.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work. Should we open it up to our friends
Yes.
here?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think if you want to ask a question, you can just jump in, or you could raise your hand, your mechanical hand or your real hand, whatever you feel comfortable doing. Now be careful, it's a little bit like an auction. If you scratch your nose, we think we're going to call on you.
Oh, Christina. Christina has a question.
Hi, I'll be brave. I'll ask the first. Well, first off, thank you so much for this event and for your artwork. I was at the opening, and I still can't stop thinking about some of the pieces. So, it does what the best artwork does. It motivates new thoughts and new feelings. So thank you for your work. One thing that really surprised me about it was how moved I was to just have a memorial to the year 2020. I think this was like the first art exhibit I had been to, since the pandemic. And then I was kind of moved, just that, like thinking about the brush fires that started the year, and thinking about a year that started with this fire and danger and chaos and something that nobody seemed to know how to get under control. So, I mean, I feel like so much of what's difficult about this moment is that we live in what feels like an endless present, and so I'm just curious, I think there's something so brilliant about the way that you are memorializing and making sense of just this one year. And I wonder if you could just talk about your choice to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was getting, to be completely honest, I think I was getting tired of, oh my God, 2020 as kind of, a year that like no other. I mean, we did have many, many moments of, a lot of suffering, but for me, it was a little bit more of all of these things have happened, but also let's look beyond, because they're all connected to a past that maybe we haven't acknowledged, or maybe it's been invisible for a very long time. So I wanted to kind of bring up, memorialize 2020 for all of the horrible things that have happened and how it has affected us to this day, but at the same time, push people to think and to look beyond the year, look back, and the connections to systems of oppression and all of the suffering that has happened to get to 2020. But also I think, because of it was such a crazy year. A lot of, as I said, my work deals with violence, and looking at mourning and loss, and looking at how do you move beyond that. And the first thing is acknowledgement. I mean, in the age of misinformation that we're dealing still with, the fakeness of things or propagandas or whatnot, at least if we have an acknowledgement that we're all have lived through this year, this 2020, we can begin the mourning process. We can start to think about ways that we, personal or even more social, how can we move beyond there and think of more, joy and hope and justice. So looking at the opposite end, we've crossed that line, we've crossed it, but now what can we do to, change things? Thank you.
Thank you.
Priscilla.
Yes. Hi to everyone, and glad to be here. And as Cristina said, just being there last Friday and enjoying and being present. First, also going to an exhibit with people around and works of art, and of Diana's work of art. I'm a colleague of hers. So this was a very powerful moment. So I salute Diana and all the people that were there. I'm going to go back to Donna's first question, that where she was asking about the intersection between your research as a scholar and literary scholar with what you are doing. And I couldn't help even both what you did today and also on Friday there the poems were there. So we are seeing the very literal connection, almost physical connection between the painting, the poetry. I know the novels that you teach in class. So you are establishing a dialogue with other artists that have some of the same or parallel questions about injustice and violence. So this dialogue is very profound. I know you also acted. So you you've got taken that into the performative level. So you teach short stories. So I really saw when Donna asked that question, how everything comes really well together. You as an artist and you as a scholar who deals with artistic productions, other people's artistic productions. So I just wanted to, you know, sort of react very positively and bring some light to some of the things that you do and what I've seen and hear from students that you do in the class, and bringing again this human rights, human production, artistic production. This is all human, and this is what I see in this artistic and abstract art that you presented us, Diana. So thank you for that gift.
Thank you, Priscilla. Yeah, one of the things that I've mentioned before, maybe in another space, is that this was essentially kind of, there's so many conversations that I'm having with the research that I've done. There was a lot of research that was done for this, and it's easy for us to think about, you know, social justice and change when we look at policies and we look at laws. But to me, the importance of the human condition, the human story, is essential for us to feel human. The acknowledgement that we are all in this what we call life world. If we're not connected by our stories, then we don't, we're not going to see each other as human. So I can give you statistics as, you know, as a researcher, but I think what's powerful is the stories of, you know, other people. And, you know, for me, I can't get away from the text. I mean, I'm a literary scholar for a reason. So, you know, I get inspired sometimes visually, sometimes by text, and I wanted to make that present. So yeah, so it's now, I feel like this art project is a ball of everything that I am: a scholar, an artist. So thank you for that, Priscilla. Hannah.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for having a virtual sort of something so that we could see it and talk about it without, you know, being physically in Hartford. And congratulations. I have a question about the process. You spoke a little bit about using like different materials and what it was like using that, but more broadly, what does the creative process look like for you, and what's significant about that process of creation to you?
Thank you, Hannah. Hannah was a student of Trinity, of mine, of many of ours. So thank you for joining. And the creative process this time around was a little different because usually when I paint, it's more intuitive. It's what I'm feeling. So it's the one time that I get to step away from, you know, kind of just research and just whatever I'm feeling. This time around, it was the research that was actually pushing through, you know, pushing through the paintings and the artwork. So I would start reading, I would start researching something, and either a word or a phrase or a story would get stuck in my head, and then I would start drawing up, because I was, you know, also methodical in that I was, you know, sketching. I was thinking about what kind of material, what kind of mediums I would use to push with the paints to create certain textures. So whereas before I would just, you know, go in, start painting, and see what comes up, and just intuitively, kind of draw an experiment. This was very structured and very methodical in that the research, and whether it was literary texts or statistics, or looking at other books, or thinking about the stuff that I've read academically, theorists, critical texts, those were influencing along the way. So this was a little different, but it definitely, I had to kind of put to the forefront a different kind of what we call embodied research of, thinking about how can I, push this research into a more creative outlet than the academic work that I do.
Anybody else have any questions? You know what, I want to mention to you that our gala again is on May 9th, and Diana was so generous to us. One of her pieces called Pride is actually on all the material that we send out about the gala, and it's going to be the front of it is the front of our invitation. And we have we call a journal at our gala. It has ads and letters and all kinds of stuff in it. And it's going to be, it's quite large, and it's going to be on the cover of that too. So we're very grateful to you for your generosity in letting us use that image, and people just love it.
Thank you, Donna.
Yeah, really brings us great joy. Any other questions before we end? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Hi.
Diane.
Hello. Thank you
Hi.
for this talk, and I'm grateful to be here with you tonight. I was very moved by the pieces, and particularly the ones that you read the poems with. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your creative process, like in terms of, did you write while you were painting, while you were envisioning the piece? Did one come before the other? Wonder how you chose which ones to write with, or if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you for that question, Diane. I actually, let me see, I'll bring up the paintings and the poem again. For this one, for the A Requiem for Their Breath, I had written this before, in 2020, in the summer of 2020. So I already had this kind of idea of kind of paying attention to breath. As we know, breath is the #1 culprit of spreading COVID. So we have to obviously wear the masks, and we have to be careful. We have to socially distance. So that was already in my mind. And then when I was reading, rereading the short story by Gabriela Damian Mirabete, They Will Dream in the Garden, which has been translated into English. It won the Tiptree Award in 2018. I really recommend it. That also was kind of in my head when I was thinking about how can I speak on COVID. And then, what came up was this idea of having, in a way, an atonement, having a mourning process. Again, a lot of these paintings have a little bit of an aerial view, because I want to push us to kind of step back, kind of zoom out and look at, there's a lot of like seeing that I'm insinuating here. So looking down onto a tree with the, literary reference around it, but looking at this essentially tomb of masks and what they symbolize kind of brought this poem essentially to life. The other one, which was this one I did together with X Marks the Spot, and this came about. I had a talk, and Christina Heatherton, Dr. Christina Heatherton is a faculty member, as a colleague in American Studies and Human Rights at Trinity. She invited me to have a conversation about, thinking about this project through the Trinity Social Justice Initiative, and in thinking about the placing, starting off with this painting, which was the first painting I had done. I wanted to again kind of place all of us into 2020 in a way, kind of, the X is 2020, but also how connected we are, and playing with the lines of connection. So, thinking about coordinates and points, while I was creating the painting, words started to come up. So in my own head, what happens is sometimes it's simultaneous, like, X marks the spot and coordinates. And sometimes it just lingers. A poem or a painting just lingers, and then I have kind of the textual or the visual representation of it. But thank you for that question. Diana.
The question, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I just noticed so many different textures within your pieces, and I was wondering, how do you go about creating texture and relating texture to the themes that you're talking about? Or if any of the textures that you create kind of happy accidents that, like, through the process of creating, that you're like, this texture really resounds with me and I want to keep going in that direction?
Thank you. Yes, it's a little bit of both. You guessed correct. Sometimes it is a little bit of happenstance. Sometimes it is a little bit of intentional. With X Marks the Spot, I had a lot of influence from some of the stuff that I was reading on map making, back in the 1500s, where they would make maps, using these, what they would call rum lines, and depicting, different colors for different connections, in maritime map making, whether that was in the Mediterranean or across the Atlantic. So I wanted to kind of emulate that with the fountain pens, with the ink. And then playing with some of the mediums, I wanted to create translucency again for this kind of overlapping, or what happens with violence, kind of it's overlapping. In some cases, it is a little bit of as a surprise. With this one, with the brush by fire. I wanted to use modeling paste, which is very thick, and it can dry out and create certain cracking. And thinking about specifically California and the Northern Pacific areas where the wildfires were happening, I wanted to create that texture to draw upon the mountains. So this one was kind of intentional. And also kind of, when all of these, I was working from a kind of looking down on them. And this one in particular, when I stepped back from the position of it being horizontal and me looking over it, I walked out and I said, I don't like this. This is not what I had intended. It doesn't make any sense. But once I saw it vertically, that's when I had a different reaction. So it's the texture and also the positioning of viewing for me was very specific and sometimes controlled. Like this one I knew I wanted to work with a specific medium and create this illusion of oil. So when you see it up close in the gallery, if you have a chance, you can even see how shiny it is. I used a very lacquered, thick varnish that smells really, really intensely. And that was purposeful because, I think the smell has died down a little bit, but I had this idea of, when you are close enough to it, then you'll start to, smell it. And having that in a small apartment was very toxic. So even just for me, it was working with these materials. Sometimes they were a little bit, as I said before, a little bit of an inconvenience. But sometimes they are purposeful, intentional. They come out the way that I want them to come out. Like this one came out the same way as the sketch that I had, and but others, I like this one, it started to do things that I was not expecting, and I just had to work around it. But yeah, thank you.
These are great questions.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Told you it's going to be like an auction, going once, going twice. Nope. Oh, no, it's Tiana again. Tiana, do you have another question?
I have a second question, but from Giselle. She wanted to know a little bit more about your piece. I believe it's called Unwelcome Embrace. And kind of like just the birth of that, and I think just kind of your creative process and just particularly that piece.
Thank you, and thank you to Giselle, who's I'm sure looking over. This was a lot of, as I said before, a lot of my research is on, border studies. So looking at the border, looking at immigration as a major topic in all of my research, not just on gendered violence, but looking at the immigration as a human right violation, many violations that are happening. So one of the things that affected me the most in the past few years at looking at the situation at the border has been the children. I think the images of children in cages, it really, really affected me in a way that I had not seen in all the years that I was researching. And I wanted to kind of, in a way, speak about that anger, that indignation of this injustice that happens at the border of the children and also the families. I mean, it started with and this is not new. I mean, the detention centers is not something new, but I think seeing it over and over and over in 2018, 19, and then in 2020 with the pandemic, it didn't, they didn't close those down. So similar to prisons, a lot of people were affected because of COVID and being in those close quarters. To me, it was just, again, thinking about the poem by Emma Lazarus and, the Statue of Liberty, and what, a lot of immigrants have this idea of the US as the, land of freedom and opportunity. And we just, again, we haven't kind of done what was that ideal. And in fact, we've I think it's hypocritical at best, cruel and violent at its core. So I wanted to actually use the material that they were using to give to children and to families to kind of remind the horror of what they had to, put on. A lot of them were not aware of what this was, what the Mylar blanket was. I mean, they're used for camping, they're used for extreme cold situations, but many of these people did not know the use of them. So as a hospitality gesture to give someone a blanket that is crackles, I read so many stories of children, of mothers who walked away horrified by that one gesture. I wanted to speak about the border, even though it was, the situation at the border with the detention centers had happened prior to 2020, even though they didn't close down because of COVID. I still wanted to talk about that. So thank you, Giselle.
There's this way that the Mylar blanket, I can't even stand using the word blanket,
Right.
it's like, we're going to give you the minimum. We kind of have to keep you warm, but it's not going to be comforting. It's not going to be soft. It's going to be crinkle like fire. It's going to scare you.
Yep.
It's just such a symbol of the cruelty that went on. And I think you really captured it. So I think we'll wrap up our evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Diana, for a wonderful discussion and for just being so courageous and open-hearted and just really, what's interesting is that, and touching is that you, in your work, you deal with such difficult topics and you do it with such grace and humanity.
Thank you, Donna.
Thank you. It's an honor. It's an honor to host your work. And everybody, I invite you to come down to Charter Oak and see this wonderful, wonderful exhibit. Bless you all. Thank you for coming. Lovely to see you.
All. Thank you, Donna, Pierre, Menu.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Have a good night. Bye.